All right, cool. So let's get started. Episode 25, High Pod.
Hey, 25.
25. Wow.
Wow.
Quarter of the way.
Of
I feel like I'm on a
100.
momentous number.
You really
there.
are.
Yeah.
That's
Well,
incredible.
I'm
man.
glad to introduce Jens Jacob, special guest for
Hey,
this
we got a
week's pod.
guest on the
Nice to
pod.
be here.
We have a lot to discuss on this pod, but I think I'd be remiss if not to give you a little bit of time to talk about yourself, your story, especially as like an Indian person that broke out, did arts, got into the creative
arts.
first, it's
That's
cool.
right. You're not a doctor.
You're not a doctor or an engineer.
You don't want me to be your doctor.
or an engineer, yeah.
But I appreciate it. So yeah, what's your story?
So basically grew up in a Indian Christian household, was born and brought up in New York and then grew up in Florida. And right around the time of like, you're trying to figure out what you want to do with your life and career, obviously there's a lot of expectations and to the joke of like going into a very standard, career path. And I think at the time I thought it was going to be computer science or something like that, right? Like that was just like a default. Knowing nothing about it, I just kind of said, yeah, sure, like that's what I'll like start my degree in. And then just you would find various ways to like create. I wouldn't even say necessarily creative. It's just create, whether it's drawing, graphic design, building something in your backyard. Like,
Right.
You would just find opportunities to create, and I think I loved doing that. It didn't matter what medium or form that took. So I wouldn't say like, if you're looking for the story of like, I always knew I wanted to be a filmmaker, that wasn't necessarily my story. It just ended up becoming the ultimate form of creation for me at the, like as I've evolved into that place. And so it started off with like graphic design, then it kind of morphed into motion design. I started working shortly after high school, I started working for the Tampa Bay Lightning, which is the hockey team out in Tampa.
Wow.
And did a lot of their like in-house motion graphics and stuff you see on the scoreboards and things like that. That was kind of like my maybe like big foray into like a professional career. Didn't think it was like a profession prior to that. It was like a hobby. I was doing a lot of church graphics or like
motion graphics was introduced to the church. It was like revolutionary.
Yeah.
It's like, wow.
Yeah,
They're gonna go viral.
Yeah. It's kind of funny to say. At the time, I was in the middle of, I don't even know if I could say this on this podcast, but it was like, there was no middle. It was either doing church graphics or club promo videos.
Yes.
Like it was
all in the same day.
Yeah.
You actually
I don't
reused
know.
the
You use the
graphic.
assets. Community building. No, yeah. So it was funny. Like I did a lot of Indian parties. Like,
oh, nice.
Like, not that I specifically did it, but like I like did a lot of the videos. Like I was like known for that in one world, and then I was known for like church videos in the
amazing.
other. Yeah, it's pretty funny. I've been redeemed since, and like we're good, but
Of course, let it be noted.
yeah. So then I think, long story long, I kind of got into this existential crisis of like, well, if I really want to take this seriously, I either have to potentially go get a degree in it, go to film school, and I started shortly afterwards, my professional career started to really take off locally, where I started working for the Tampa Bay Lightning, did some stuff for ESPN locally. Like we were a part of this show called Gruden's QB Camp.
Oh, I remember that show. That's
show.
cool.
Crazy,
That's
right?
a great show.
I was a part of season 1 for that, and crazy, wouldn't have thought that was going to be the show that it became. It went on to like be nominated and winning.
Oh, it was an
ESPYs
amazing show.
Yeah, and just to be around. And funny enough, I'm not into sports, so like,
Oh, wow.
it
Hilarious.
wasn't. It was like the most like unusual like role for me, and all my cousins and friends were jealous, like in terms of like being a part of it, but I didn't really care. But at the same time, I could still see the passion
Yep.
that they
So
had
you were on the
for that.
production set on that project? or
Yeah,
what were you doing?
I was like a gaffer / second cam up on that.
There you go.
Yeah,
Started from the bottom.
Actually, that was pretty high. I'm surprised I didn't start from PA on something like that.
That's interesting that sets have those gaffer.
Right.
Like,
Yeah.
wow.
Yeah.
That's so interesting.
Totally. And I mean, obviously ESPN's a big name, but what we were talking about back then was like very small. It was like a couple lights and like, like Gruden and like a quarterback just talking. It was like an interview setup. So
Totally.
it wasn't that crazy of a setup to do or production to do. And then decided I wanted to take it seriously, and I was going through an existential crisis at the time because my family, like, you know, they wanted the best for me. So that what they knew as the best was what they knew as success, and
sure.
what they knew like the career path
You're
would
like,
be.
Like, parents, I'm a gaffer. What are you talking about?
Yeah, duh. I'm a gaffer
Don't
for
worry.
ESPN. Like,
Yeah, what were they saying in that time?
I don't think they fully understood.
Sure.
You know, is a lot of it. Like they didn't know what I was doing. It looked like a hobby. It looked like ministry. It looked like, you know, other things than like a career or like something that you can make money off or sustainable like money off to take care of a family. And I think that's what they were looking for.
Are your parents first generation?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Wait, which one is first generation? Because I thought I was first generation.
Is it? Yeah, I don't know. I always assume.
This is like a great thing to like clarify.
Yeah.
I think of first generation as in that I was born here first.
Yes.
Oh, is that what
that
the-
is the
Yes.
that
That's
is
the
the
Okay, yeah.
definition.
Yeah,
Okay,
sorry.
yeah.
So they immigrated over, and
yes.
then I'm first generation.
Okay.
You know, they wanted the best for me, and there was some clear paths for what that looked like. And I remember there was one particular conversation I had with my dad, and it was around God's will for my life. My dad's a pastor. I'm a PK. So I'm
that's
very
it.
challenged and very.
That's another dynamic.
Yeah. It was some deep rooted issues. No, I'm kidding.
You're not a doctor, Dad. I'm a doctor for the Lord.
Well, this is what's interesting about that because, you know, one of the first things that he said to me, which I'm grateful for, was he said, you know, pray about it and see what God's will in your life was. And at the time, I don't think I've ever done that.
Wow.
Which is weird to say that I grew up in the church, you know, was probably like 18, 19 at the time. But I don't think I had ever like thought about prayer or as a way to align myself with what God's will was.
Right.
Versus that it was like a wish list or like a, you know,
Like
praying
a
for
genie.
healing.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So that happened, and then did that, went out to my room and like prayed, you know, for that. And I felt like I did get clarity on like that this was what I was supposed to do. I was supposed to move to LA. And which is so weird because like I'm sure anybody hearing like move to LA, like that's like such a like aha moment, like in terms of like anybody would want to move to LA. But for me, I didn't really want to go to LA at the time.
Sure.
It was actually the scariest option out of the three options that I was considering.
Interesting.
It was either go to Miami, go to New York, or go to LA, because that was kind of like where major markets were in terms of like the film industry at the time. Miami was so close to Tampa that it felt like it was so close to home. New York, I knew a lot of people there, so I felt like it was another way to be comfortable because I just had like friends and family there. And then LA, I knew nobody, so it was like survive or live in a box is what it felt like. And I didn't want to be the prodigal son. I didn't want to come back. Come back home.
Right.
That wasn't even an option for me, even though I knew biblically it's supposed to be. But it wasn't in my head. It was not an option.
Sure.
And so I felt like, okay, I got clarity. I'm going to ask God, and you know, it prayed about it and got clarity. I went back and told my dad about it, and I was like, Dad, I think I got clarity. Like I'm supposed to move to LA. He's like, okay, and they laughed at me. Like it was like, really painful.
Pray again.
Pray again. Yeah. And you know, I as much as I joke around about like some of the stuff that had happened, it hurt at the time because it was like, yo, you told me to do this. And I'm very grateful. My dad's an amazing person and has been such a huge supporter since, but it was hard for them. That's all I can kind of chalk it up to. Like they don't know how to like, you know, everybody's learning how to parent in real time. And on top of that, you're trying to instill wisdom spiritually and then also go by what your definition of that is. Like you can only define success sometimes by like your standards or your kind of like upbringing in that. And so that turned into a huge argument, and I was like, Dad, you told me to like pray about it, and like now you're telling me that it's not it, and I was like, well, you tell me, you're the pastor, like you tell me like what it is that you have in my life. And I was really surprised because he had a pretty clear answer. And it was, he said, well, I was like, well, so what am I supposed to do? He's like, well, you're supposed to finish school. And at the time I was going to I did drop out of school to pursue this. I'm not advocating for that on the pod. You should go to school to have, you know, a degree and all that. But I didn't necessarily need it for what I was doing.
Sure.
That was it. And so then he said, oh, like it's for you to like finish your degree. And then I was like, I just kept asking questions. I was like, in what? And then he's like, oh, a business. And then I was like, and then what? And then he would say, for you to go get a job in like and work at a bank. I was like, oh, okay. And then what? And then he said for you to be an executive in that bank. And then I was like, and then what? And then to get married. And then it just kept going, right? And then where it ended was, and then for you to like help lead the church, essentially. And that's when I kind of reconciled in my head. I was like, oh, my dad is God in this particular like scenario,
right?
In the sense that like it was his will at the time. And again, like I don't think he realized it in that sense. He was just trying to guide me in the best way that he thought he could guide me. But it really drove me into, I stopped believing in God at that moment.
Wow.
It was kind of a really surreal moment because I was like, oh, this is just a way for parents to instill or to put a boogeyman version of like power
for
control in your life. And that's kind of how I kind of shaped theology at that point.
Interesting.
And it was really bad for me. Like, and I haven't shared that like really publicly, like until more recently. And I don't blame my parents either. That's the one thing that I don't think it was their fault or their ill intention or anything like that. And so then this is kind of how I ended up leaving. I ended up just deciding to like double down, and I'm like, I'm going, and decided to move to LA, but I needed their blessing. It was kind of this like catch-22 of like, I want to leave and get out here and do my own thing, but I can't leave until like I know that you're okay with it. And so thankfully they were like, okay, like go try it out for like 3 months and then like, you know, come back. So that's kind of how I left. It was when they did this this arrangement that I was just going to just go there for just a season. And then didn't know a single soul out there. I had some family in Orange County, and they let me like sleep on their couch for like the first month as I like, you know, try to figure it out and get on my own 2 feet. Never like moved away from home at that point. Didn't really like have any other kind of net that was there. You know, I think had barely like maybe like $4,000 to my name at the time. Like it wasn't like any kind of responsible, you know, decision in terms of like moving out and being on my own. And then when I got there, I got really, I would say it's like the perfect blend of like luck, favor, and will that happened in terms of a lot of the early parts of my career. I started, even though I had started doing things at maybe a higher level in terms of roles in Tampa, I decided I wasn't going to tell anybody in LA like how much I knew. I was just going to really start from the bottom this time. And so I ended up PAing, interning, whatever I could do to just be on set, because I remember
PAing is getting coffee and
exactly. It's like the lowest position in the film industry. And I got to like get on the first set through a friend that was like my cousin's friend at the time. I wasn't even like really close with him, and he let me come on his set, which was a music video for Neon Trees. I don't know if you remember the song Animal.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Back in the day, like it was like their next big like song, which I don't know if it did well or not. But so we were doing the music video for that, and I was just like I was just a director's friend. I wasn't even a PA. I was just there to like watch the set. And it was the first time that I got to be on a major set, and it blew my mind. Like I was doing like child's play compared to like what they were doing. I mean, there's like 60 people on set, and you know, you're transforming an entire like space to like, you know, I had never experienced anything like that, and I was like, oh, this is for sure. Like, I want to know more about this. I want to learn. I want to understand. So I didn't know anything at the time. I didn't know what a producer did, and didn't know.
So something like awakened in you, like something 100%. Was ignited.
Yeah.
Like, wow.
You know, I say now, like, what the thing that I love about the film industry is, it feels like to me that it's like in its current is like the highest form of art and creation. And what I mean by that is it's the paramount because it requires all the other art forms for it to be filmmaking, right? You take music out, you take picture out, you take drawings out, design, fashion, whatever it might be.
It's not film.
You don't have film anymore.
Wow.
And I think that's what I loved about it the most, is that I could be a part of all of this instead of having to like maybe just pick one,
Sure.
like be a part of a label or music or something like that. So yeah, my first year was all music videos. Been on some like really cool sets from Neon Trees, Nicki Minaj, Bruno Mars, Lil Wayne, Nickelback, like, you know, you name it. Been
So
able
from
to
club promoter to music videos.
Wow.
Come on, this is awesome.
That's awesome.
I love
yeah,
it.
it's kind of fitting, right? Like the video side of it. And then second year was commercials. I got to be a part of like some
Yeah.
really cool commercial sets. Like I remember second year, like the second commercial I was doing, I was signing an NDA and I didn't even know what for. Like I had signed onto the job before even knowing like what it was for. And it ended up being an Apple spot. Like we did the iPad 3 launch,
Oh, cool.
which was like such a surreal moment because I was such a Apple fanboy,
Right,
and,
right.
you know, to be a part of that and
Don't-
see the
don't tell
iPad.
Zach.
Yeah, and to be a part of that and like finally see a product released before it got released, like it was an
amazing.
unbelievable feeling
What
at
a
the
privilege.
time.
Wow.
Yeah. I can continue, but you tell
No,
me.
so this is interesting because your career is really starting to take off now, from music videos to commercials for Apple. Obviously, somewhere in there, you're simplifying it, but you worked your way up from PA to, you know, getting higher up in the production. What's your parents thinking at this point?
Yes, it must have been well past 3 months, right? This is like year 2, right, of your journey?
Yeah, a lot happened in the first 6 months. I mean, I went from PA to producing within 6 months.
Oh, wow.
It was
That's God.
Yeah,
That's God.
and that's what I mean. Like there was just like this perfect storm of things that were happening at the time. This producer that I was working a lot with that got me onto a lot of the gigs. The story that I even shared at FlowCon, she had really took me under her wing, and she was just starting to launch. It was kind of like right timing because she wasn't like a really well-known producer, but she's like now the queen of music video producing. And she's done like, she has probably more credits than anybody that I know in terms of music videos. And I was just starting to get onto ground level of that. And it just kind of was like right time. And it was a lot of, just because I was there. So one of the parts that I love sharing about my story is that I didn't really share with people how much I knew about it. I just constantly humbled myself that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to like be a part of it.
Well, that's what we say actually in leadership, right? It's not actually about capability; it's about availability.
Yeah.
Very true.
Will
So
you be
true.
around? Will you say
Honestly,
yes?
I showed up to her apartment, which was the production office at the time, like even when she didn't ask. It was just like I wanted to be around them so much.
Gen Z,
Yeah.
are we listening?
Yeah, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, honestly, like I took any kind of pride that I had that I worked for ESPN or did any of this stuff, and I was like, you know what, I want to learn from this person and this team. So whatever I can do to do that, and I think from just being available, being around, and then seeing that she could task me something and I would go above and beyond, or I would figure it out. A lot of filmmaking is problem solving.
There it is.
At the end of the day, so if you can be a good problem solver, I think you can go into any industry. Frankly, not even just filmmaking. But I think that skill that I had early on, I just knew that I need to take problems off of her plate and help solve them.
There's so many great principles in that, and obviously it led to this rise. There's favor, but we partner with God, right? And
Yes.
so there are characteristics and principles that He works through that you're learning in real time, and you're seeing the fruit of it, right? And so you know,
true,
your parents probably, are they changing their tune? Like, what's happening?
Yeah, sorry, I just realized that was the original question. In the first 3 to 6 months, I think it was still very hard for them. And I would say where it really changed for them is when I had started at the time Sypher Films. I went from like freelancing on a lot of these big jobs to then creating my own company, and then really starting to just develop my own clientele and and then I started doing some nonprofit work. And I think when they saw that my talent could still uphold like faith in God, I think they just were like internally afraid that I was going to LA and that I was ultimately turning from God. That's I think at the core of like their fear and why they were not okay with a lot of it. But I think once they saw that, I think that changed, and it was like one of the first times in my life that they said that they were proud of me. I had not heard those words prior to moving.
You're the first
to LA.
Indian. No, it's just
First Indian.
I'm still waiting. I'm still looking for
family.
that.
I think that's when they started to realize when they weren't close to me in proximity that words really mattered. Because our family wasn't a words of affirmation type of family. It was acts of service and a lot of, I'm taking care of you. You're living. Like, you know.
Similar in Asian culture.
Yeah. And I think once the separation was there and I was on the other side of the country, I think that's when they started to realize I need to tell him I love him. I need to tell them that I'm proud of him. And I'm so proud of my parents for even getting to that place.
Totally.
And so, and a lot of it, me and my brother tried to like model, like we would say it first and then, but there are still families now where that's weird. Like even my wife's family, like my wife jokes around that like, you're an I love you family. And I'm like, I didn't even realize that was a thing.
Can I ask though, you said when you left for LA, at that point, your faith was kind of, had changed because of like the interactions with your father at the time.
Good question.
But then at this point, you know, it sounds like your faith had kind of come back. Was there a pivoting moment when you were in LA where it came back?
Yeah, great question. A lot of it being in LA was kind of like me kind of a clean slate into everything. Like it was clean slate to career, friends, faith, all of it. And I think from that, I was able to discover what I believed versus what my parents believed and what I was starting to like distill for myself. And, you know, some of it was, it was a very lonely, like first year in LA. I was, not a lot of people know this, but I was like sleeping on couches. Like, I mean, meaning like, a lot of LA is like shared living and you're just trying to like make it work. And so, like the first two or three places that I had, I deliberately didn't even like get a bed in my bedroom. I wanted it to feel like an office and I just wanted to hustle. So I just was like living on a couch literally the first 3 years of being there. And it was a very lonely process. And I think once you go through something like that, or like when you're journeying or like you're starting something new, and when there isn't anybody, particularly when it comes to distraction, you kind of only have God in that. And I felt that like deeply that I knew God had me, and I had to discover what my relationship with Christ was at that point. And so in really like, you know, going through that process of allowing myself to feel at that level and bring myself to there, I think I was able to then get plugged into the right church and was able to, just really discover what faith, it was like a reconstruction of faith at the time for me. A big pivotal point in my faith journey was trying to understand how, like purpose in life. I'm trying to understand like, how does this align with purpose and all that. And at the time, I was really big into TED Talks. That's kind of like where I went to for...
As we all were.
Yeah.
Old school TED Talks, bring those back.
in a way, that was like Bible for me at the time, because I was consuming that more than anything else in terms of inspiration and knowledge and understanding. And I think this stat is true, but at the time, Pastor Rick Warren was the only pastor that I knew that had given a TED Talk at the time. And he did a TED Talk around the success and struggles that happened after releasing the second best-selling book after the Bible, Purpose Driven Life.
Wow.
And it's crazy to even think that, right? Like that's how successful that book was. Like the Bible almost seems like a given to be most successful, but then you were the next, human created, most successful book. And he was talking a little bit about the book, and admittedly at the time I hadn't read the book. I just kind of knew about it because everybody and their moms were going through the life groups and stuff with that book. And part of the proposition of the book was he shares a story about Moses and how Moses was a shepherd, and he kind of like used that analogy of like what was in his hand at the time, and his hand inside of his hand was a staff, right?
Yeah.
And there was a very practical element to that in terms of leading, because it was you're taking a herd of sheep and then you're using the staff to like pull or push. I can't remember the exact analogy, but it was very profound at the time. And this idea of like what was in your hand, like kind of distilling it to that question in terms of like how purpose can, be manifested through, or God's will in your life.
Good.
It was very profound to me, because prior to that, it was always the Bible, the pulpit.
Yeah.
I was going to then potentially take over the church, and that was ministry, or that was the way that you would have purpose in your life, was to do something within the church. Could never see it prior to that as outside of the church. And so at the time, what was so profound about that was when I asked myself, well, what's in my hand? It was a camera.
Good.
And, you know, to understand that could be my influence, my power. And one of the things that he was, the analogy that he gave to that was, you know, for somebody like a basketball player, what's in their hand is obviously a basketball, but the identity of that basketball continues even thereafter her playing basketball.
Nice.
Right? This person will always remain a basketball player to like everybody. And so then what do you do with that? What do you do with that influence? What do you do with that? And so for me, it was this camera and like, you know, what it would look like in terms of films. And so it was very clear to me at the time that God was going to use me in this way, whether that's overt or not. I'm not saying that I'm a faith film or like a faith filmmaker in the sense of that I'm only going to make Christian films, but there was a lot of purpose that he had instilled in me in what I was going to be able to do with this.
But any film you make, you're going to glorify God.
Exactly.
And that's what is such a beautiful thing I'm taking away from your story. Thanks for sharing your story. That's incredible. That there were so many times I wanted to stop you, but I was just like, okay.
Oh no, I ramble, so stop me.
No, because there was so much principles we could have pulled out, but people are smart on this podcast that listen to it. They'll pull out the principle. But something that I took away was the goodness of God. The goodness of God in your life. But what's so interesting is the way that the goodness of God works in and through our lives is not necessarily how we would write it.
Right.
So your story was rejection. Your story was poverty, sleeping on a couch, right?
Yeah.
Your story was, you know, really starting from ground level. Your story was, some failure, right? All these things, but actually God used all those things. And it's really the power of our perspective sometimes to understand that, yes, God is in the success, but God is most definitely in the rejection.
Oh, definitely.
God is most definitely in the loneliness. Actually, you know what scripture informs us is that actually in the suffering and in the struggle is where he's closest.
Yes.
Right? And it's actually in that process that you found God for yourself.
100%. Yeah.
Which then became the catalyst for reconciliation between you and your dad.
Yes.
Coincidentally, right?
Yeah.
And so I think that is so good. I think also too, you know, that revelation of, hey, actually my purpose doesn't need to be limited to being a pastor in a church, but actually what God put in my hand, even outside the four walls of the church, can be used to glorify him.
Yeah.
What an unlock.
Right.
My goodness.
It was so profound. Yeah.
That's like the purpose of this podcast.
Yeah.
Right? That's the purpose
Exactly.
of what we did last week, FlowCon.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
that's
let's
so
talk
good.
about that actually. So I know you also, on top of Sypher, you're also in the fintech space as well. You're CEO, co-founder of Saturation.
Yeah.
And so recently we just had Overflow kicked off their inaugural FlowCon. You were there, you were
Yes.
able to speak. Can you guys, I wasn't there, I unfortunately missed out.
Oh, you weren't there?
Yeah, so like I know the
He had
previous
massive
years.
FOMO.
Massive
Yeah.
FOMO. So can you,
You
guys
missed out
give me a
for sure.
taste of what happened? Give me a recap of what happened at FlowCon.
Well, it was really, we've been saying this all week, a collision of collaboration between this hype network, right, that we're doing right here, and Overflow and Vibe Church, and just kind of not even just blurring the lines, but removing the lines
Yeah.
from
Yeah.
what church ministry and marketplace can look like, right? It's really hard to explain what was captured in that room, but we'll try our best.
Yeah.
We're missing one very important component here, Pastor Adam,
Yeah.
who's traveling to one of our international campuses right now. But Jens was in the room. What was your take? I mean, you were one of our panel speakers. By the way, guys, if you haven't caught up, if I fast forward Jen's story a little bit, God continues to be so good and bring favor and blessing on his career. If you haven't seen yet, After Death, released this past year. And it was across over 2,800 theaters. Getting that right, across the nation. It's now streaming on all major streaming platforms right now. And it's not a Christian movie, but it's definitely a movie that provokes thought because everybody's going to die, right? And it's a deep dive into that. hopefully compelling people to ask some pretty important questions, which I think can be a gateway to point to Jesus. But, because of just how God has been moving your career, we invited you to be a panel speaker. So you were part of FlowCon. What was your experience?
I didn't know what to expect.
Right.
I think I had zero expectations in terms of just, I'm going to show up. But I was profoundly impacted. A lot of the conversations that were happening and just the community you guys have curated. I didn't expect to meet a lot of amazing people. And I just love that there is that blurring of the line, or the idea that you can do more in the marketplace.
Good.
And you can, impact, people and do ministry at the same time. So I love, and so I felt like I was a student to it, in some ways. I was learning just as much as I was, maybe up on stage, but I loved it. I mean, I think what you guys are creating here, and to be a small part of that, I feel very honored to take part.
It's we now, because you've been part of multiple hype events.
Yeah.
And this
Where's my
inaugural...
card? Do I get a platinum, or titanium
okay.
card or something?
Arun's on it.
We got you.
well, I'll say this. In the inaugural FlowCon, just some numbers, right, that we can reflect on. Because we had the, ye of little faith moment where we only printed 200 shirts because we thought that was kind of the scope of people, entrepreneurs, innovators, kingdom-minded business people that would be attracted to something like this. Were we wrong? My gosh. It was
so
really incredible. Over 350 paid registered guests that made an investment. Probably half of them flew in.
That's right.
Invested into accommodation to be with us for just a few days, skipped out on work or paused, their entrepreneurial endeavors to really invest into being part of what I would call history in the making, the very, very first FlowCon. Of those 350 people, 50 churches were represented, which is really, really cool. So pastors, entrepreneurial, pastors were in the room. Then you had over 190 companies represented. And so some of those companies, we had the founder, we had the CEO, we had the owner of the business in the room. For some of the companies, it was executive team, C-suite, or even just directors and managers if it was a larger company, right? We had over 70 cities represented with people traveling internationally. We had a group from Switzerland, from Zurich come in. We had people traveling in from Mexico, people flying in from India coming in. And it was just an incredible time. I think what was the common thread that I felt in the room, I'd love your take, Jens, is that there was an earnest hunger and appetite to innovate, to build, whether it was a tech company, a film, a real estate company. It was actually spanning a lot of different industries, but an earnestness to build for the kingdom, for honoring God, for glorifying God. Is that the sense that you got?
Yeah. I mean, I had originally thought, just because of obviously Overflow's core base being churches, I thought it was going to be more just maybe church centric, but the fact that a lot of them were startups, and even maybe churches or startups for churches or vice versa.
Right.
I thought that was really cool to see. I wasn't expecting a lot of that, the different types of marketplaces that were represented there.
Yeah.
And I think it's really interesting, at least 2 hype events ago. One of the through lines is, you mentioned it, being a problem solver spans across all different kind of scopes of what you do for work.
There you go.
And this is a bringing together of all those different places of work, and everybody there is a problem solver, but they want to do it for the kingdom. So it's kind of that's what I assumed was happening, and it's good to hear that's kind of there. So.
Well, the caliber of people in the room too.
Totally.
So we can talk about a couple of the panel speakers. We had Chiwa Chen in the room. We had one of my board members, Mackie Saturday, in the room. We had Nancy Duarte. It was crazy. So Chiwa, early investor into the Facebook, right? When it was called the Facebook, that's how early he was. Early investor into TikTok when it was called ByteDance, right? Early investor into Spotify, right? We got Nancy Duarte, who's done so much work with Apple, actually her first client and currently existing client, but she is the GOAT in terms of presentation design. And then Mackie Saturday created the brand for Instagram, and also in the spiritual space for the Bible Project, which we all know and love, probably if you're listening to this podcast. And what was so impacting to me is that we had these people that are at the top of their game telling stories about how there was multiple inflection points, there was multiple moments in their career where they could either serve profit or people, or they can either serve, the bottom line, or they can serve God. And how core to each and every one of them at the end of the day is, how am I going to align myself, kind of like your story, with God's will? How do I make sure that my career, my company, my business endeavors is glorifying God? And when you hear that from people that are at the top of their game, it hits different.
Yeah.
It's like, it was like this great permission that filled the room, because in the room there was some successful people, but I would say the majority of people in there would probably identify as, I'm still trying to make it. Right. And so there was this kind of collective permission in the room of okay, cool. I can work on advancing in my career or advancing my company, not at the sake of my Christianity, actually in alignment with my passion and my love for God. And I felt like that permission was palpable in the room. But even the caliber of the question askers, Arun, it was hilarious. There's this one person that asked a question while we were on a panel, I think. He actually goes to Vive Oakland. And he was like, hey, so I got a question. We just figured out how to turn air into fertilizer.
Wow.
When should we start the company?
Yeah.
First of all, everybody was just like, wait, what did he just say? And then Mackie was like, does it work? And he's like, yeah. It took us 5 years, but breakthrough, it works. Everybody was just like, get started. This is,
leave.
You're saying you're God. What is happening?
It's almost like he needed that moment to be the permission to start. And it's like, whoa.
But that was even just the caliber of the question askers. And so it was 350 people like this, collaborating with each other, meeting each other, sharing ideas. And we say this, and we said it all throughout the conference, that you're one connection away from your breakthrough. I don't know of all the stories yet.
Yes.
I've heard just a couple of them. But I get the sense that in a few months, in a few years, we're going to start hearing these stories of these breakthrough innovations, these breakthrough companies, these breakthrough founders, and they just might point back to what happened at FlowCon. That would be cool.
No, that's amazing. And I just want to say, I saw the announcement, 2025 FlowCon already in the books.
Go.
So I just want this to be your pitch. Plan ahead.
Let's go.
Plan ahead to make it. I know for sure I'm going to be there. So I'm really excited to see what, this kind of the fruit that's produced from this. So
it's going to be amazing.
And just kind of on that topic, I think a lot of the stuff about what you were saying, even hearing your story, I think a lot of the stuff that is really powerful is, even if you're building products, the number one thing you need to be able to do is storytell, right?
Yeah.
How do I tell the story around the product that I'm building? Even for this guy that's making air to fertilizer, he needs to be able to tell that story, right? Because I'm an engineer, so from my point of view, I always thought it was, you just build good tech and they'll come. You build it and they'll come, right? But for you're in the storytelling business, and we've talked about deeper connections and building those relationships. What is it about storytelling that makes you so passionate?
I mean, for me at least, our company, the types of stories that we tell, the crazy thing about that is we do a lot of true stories, a lot of things that might be already out there, and sometimes it's because they're stranger than fiction. And for us, it's the basic level of how humans connect is sharing stories and being able to relate and to understand, what this person's going through walking through their shoes. And I think it's a basic connection level component that often gets missed, that, you think you might have to go right to the product, or you might have to go right to the, sound or music or whatever it might be. And people miss that there's lost art in that sometimes, of being able to find positioning within how you tell your story, and what you can kind of glean off of that. I don't know if that answered your question, but
no, yeah. I think that's around it. It's so maybe an example would be pretty interesting. So at last Super Bowl, we had another one of those Jesus campaigns. I don't know if you guys had a chance. He gets us, right? And so I'll just play it in the background, but essentially it was trying to break down kind of the more modern view of what love would look like from Jesus as well. And so just curious, there's these opportunities for, in the faith space and in media to be able to get the the word out about Jesus. But sometimes, like there's a lot of controversy about, kind of how this came out and if you saw
What's
it.
the controversy?
It's, like what love truly is and what they're trying to portray, versus, what maybe some of the more like conservative Christians would say, or what's really in the Bible, right, about this stuff. So, yeah, like in terms of like when you're telling stories, and especially because you're trying to do that crossover with faith as well, like how difficult is it to really get this right?
I mean, it's very difficult just because of you have a lot of opinions, and particularly when you're talking about something as core as faith, there's a lot of identity that kind of like comes like just inherently with that, and so if you and it could be true for this, right? Like if it's slightly like opposing maybe something that's very core to like biblical, and a lot of the stuff that we like to touch is like almost like modern day retakes or like extra biblical and like how that like applies to your life. Like I always say that like faith and the story of Christ and redemption is like in my DNA. It's not necessarily always like right on the front side of like the screen of what we do. So it's a constant like art and balance. But I think if the principles are there, the fruits of the Spirit, the like kind of redemption kind of elements, like that's the kind of stuff that we love touching on. And I think that DNA you'll see across all of our projects. It doesn't matter if it's a commercial for Huggies or if it's a it doesn't always have to be as overt. I think, in my opinion, for me, it's principle. Like when you can carry that through, it resonates with people. Like, I think for the people that are of faith, they automatically, immediately will like see it and feel it. And for the ones that aren't, they'll know that there's something special there. They just don't know. They might call it something else. Yeah, it might be labeled the universe. It might be labeled, faith, or but we know what it is.
I'd be curious to see what both of your takes are on this. And it seems like I don't think there's malicious intent when it comes to generating this kind of content, but it feels like they open it up a little bit more because they want to attract more people to it. And then the hope is that once they are in this space, it's like all are welcome, that saying that was there. And then once they're in that space, then, they'll just let Jesus take over. I'm just curious what you think is like, is that the misstep? It's just like, you want to kind of open up the sales, funnel a little bit more and just get people in and then hope that you can kind of correct it as they get in.
Hey, that's a good kind of perspective, right? It does kind of feel sales funnel-y, huh?
Yeah.
But that's not what spirituality is, right? At the end of the day, God saves, and there's certain ingredients and dynamics that are important to that process, right? And so, the acknowledgement that we are a sinner, and there's this process called repentance, right? Those are all like literal critical components of the salvation process, right? And so, yes, the Holy Spirit is the one that ultimately saves and convicts, and then it's our response to acknowledge our sin and to repent of our sin. On Sunday, we do it every single Sunday. We invite people to say the sinner's prayer, right? And to receive the goodness of God and the grace of God. What's problematic, I think, sometimes with some of these ads, specifically He Gets Us, is that some of the images could be a distortion of what Jesus actually did, right? And so, okay, yes, Jesus washed feet of His disciples, right? And then you start opening up the aperture and you start, telling a story that might not be theologically consistent, right? It could bring confusion. And I think that's some of the problematic nature of, some of these ads. It's not even just limited to He Gets Us, right? I think this is going to be a challenge with storytelling overall, especially, and this is the part, right? Especially when you are directly saying you're representing Scripture.
Right.
I think actually sometimes it's easier to not put the explicit label
Yeah.
that this is Jesus,
Totally.
but more take the route that you typically take, Jens, which is like, hey, I'm going to try to extract some biblical principle.
Yeah.
And I'm going to try to tell a compelling story based on this biblical principle. But it gets harder when, so that's why probably The Chosen was really difficult
Yeah. I'm actually surprised that
because they're reenacting the Bible.
Right.
Well, I'm surprised they got maybe away with a lot of the things that they do because they tend to, because it's a whole, series that's based on a couple verses, you're doing a lot of extra biblical kind of maybe takes on certain things. Like I think Matthew had like some sort of was on the spectrum and like things like that aren't like quite. So I was surprised that the audience was mature enough
Right.
to
give that creative license.
give the creative license to understand what is biblical, what's not, what kind of helps maybe color picture, but it's not like redrawing the picture.
And that's the part.
Yeah.
It feels like some of he gets us to, I haven't seen all of it,
Right,
but the
right.
ones I've seen, some of the images feels like it's redrawing
That's interesting.
the picture. And I think if you're literally saying, oh, no, this is exactly what Jesus did, but it feels like you've redrawn what Jesus did, I feel like that can cause confusion.
Can you dive into that a little bit more? Because like the difference between The Chosen and then these commercials, where it was like, from your point of view, it was the audience was able to be a little bit more mature, maybe, and interpret it the right way. Do you think that's the job of the audience then of the commercials if he gets us not to interpret
Well,
it?
I think
as
it comes
redrawing?
to the ultimate premise of even just that phrase, he gets us, right? I think the point is, do we get him?
Interesting. Yeah.
Now, I don't fully understand the controversy. Is part of the controversy with meaning just because I haven't like done a deep dive to know and I haven't seen a lot of the commercials, is part of it that it's like giving license to.
I think that would be probably some of the critique.
Okay,
I think
gotcha.
probably some of the critique is what Arun said earlier of the idea of come as you are is an incomplete idea.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So, the good news is very good news, right? But then it kind of becomes challenging news.
Right.
So what I mean is like the grace of God, you could not earn it. There's nothing that you could do. And you can receive it no matter how jacked up you were,
Yep.
no matter how messed up you were, no matter how many mistakes you were. That's why the grace of God is so compelling, right? That's why the grace of God, that there's so much anointing that breaks the yoke in that, because the forgiveness, no matter what you've done, is so good and so palpable. Literally, God sent his son to die for humanity that would believe. Right. And so that goodness is so good. But then when you say, I receive Jesus's death as a sacrifice for my sins, you're now saying, okay, cool. I received his goodness. Now it's my turn to die. That's the challenging news.
Right.
Right. Is like, okay, now it's my turn to come into full submission to your ways. And that's kind of I'm saved and also being saved, right?
Yeah.
It's this constant process of, yes, thank you, God, for your salvation, but now you are Lord.
Right.
And I think that is the incomplete idea of
So
he
it's
gets
kind of
us.
like this, the idea of like maybe the commercial state as in the come as you are, and then it's being interpreted as stay as you are.
Yep.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Potentially.
Gotcha.
Right?
Yeah.
But I do think the basis, though, of what my opinion, it's just my opinion, of some of the drawings and the images seeming to be a redrawing that's not fully scripturally accurate. What I'm saying is that could be in and of itself confusing,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That's why I say, man, big ups to those that want to tackle projects like The Chosen, because you're really saying, we're going to reenact actual scripture,
Yeah.
and that's got to be a big challenge.
Yeah. There's this, I'm going to butcher it, and I probably should know the verse, but the one that challenged me about this particular subject matter is there's a verse in the Bible that distills down to, even if it was done poorly, like the representation of like my name, as long as Christ was glorified, then he can redeem it essentially. And I got really like, challenged by that particular verse, because I think I was the first to critique not stuff like that, but to pastors or like things that were happening in the church in terms of like that didn't feel like biblical and stuff like that. And I remember reading this verse, and it like really stopped my like thought process on that, because like I'm trying to like I don't fully know the organization behind the This Is Us and like all that, and like
Neither
what
do
they're
I.
what even like where they get their funding from, or what their mission is, or I know that they hired 72 and Sunny, which is a huge ad agency in LA. They're not faith-based, so they're just probably the more skilled executor than they are the vision behind it. Because I think it's hard to be all things to all people in the terms of like, if that commercial was supposed to communicate from like the grace to like come to the altar, like, and like, change. I don't know if a 30-second commercial would ever do that.
Right.
At the same time, that doesn't mean that we shouldn't like hold like certain like principles and stuff like that. Because I would have thought to the critique that you're having, which I think is a fair critique, I thought more people would have had to The Chosen. Just because of it is actually direct biblical. So that really is kind of interesting to see like where we've evolved in terms of what people are okay with or not. And I think it actually partially has to do with who's saying it and what side of the aisle you're saying it from.
I also think my artistic critique is it seems to be trying to conform to culture more than it is trying to contrast culture.
Sure.
And my thing is some of the most beautiful art brings an incredible contrast. That's why whether you love him or hate him, Kanye has produced some of the most compelling art because he's such a contrast, right? And some of the things that he's produced typically have been in that vein. And so the conformity to me to culture. So like this whole idea, again, the premise, he gets us. It's almost speaking to what culture. It's like it's this whole idea of like, okay, what's in it for me? I just want somebody to see me and get me and somebody just affirm me and accept
to affirm my
me.
identity.
And it's kind of like, okay, that's what everybody's saying. I think he gets us could have been mistaken for, are you talking about my company? That's what they tell me.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying? And so even from an artistic perspective, I feel like it's too much conforming to some of the DEI narrative and things like that, where it's like, okay, well, sure, there's probably elements in that we can extract biblical principle, but that's actually no different from what the world is trying to preach, which is definitely not Jesus, right? Does that make sense?
Was that always their campaign, or just this particular?
No, that's always
Super
been
Bowl?
there.
Okay,
So
gotcha.
they've done this 2 Super Bowls in a row.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I mean, like you said, it's hard to please everybody, but like it's nice though that there is an attempt, I think, to kind of intercept that plane of like what would usually be a non-Christian kind of space. Like the Super Bowl is just like commercials that don't exist, but like there also is a responsibility if you are entering that space to not create more confusion, like Pastor Vance is saying. And on that topic, it's kind of interesting now with like generative AI. I'd be curious to hear what your thoughts are, and this ability now for anybody to create mass amounts of content, especially in like the film or media space, and like how that's been for you, and like how you're taking advantage of like Gen AI in film.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely the most amount of like questions I think has resulted out of the most recent Sora that had come out, and even the industry this last year has been having the conversation more from the standpoint of image and likeness, the idea of how do you protect actors or people that are now able to remix, because essentially generative AI is just training on existing things, and you're just basically at some point it's modeled or trained off of like an existing photo and so on. Or I mean, we've even used it more recently on one of my films where, and with the actor's permission, or sorry, the subject's permission, we would close gaps in lines by training the AI, the voice. And then, so instead of having to re-record or sometimes it could be, tens of thousands of dollars to like bring everybody back together, we just trained the voice, and then like off camera or whatever, creating a new line or whatever, and was able to put a lot of pieces together in that sense.
In your opinion, is it pretty indistinguishable?
Yeah.
That's so cool.
It was pretty scary how indistinguishable it was. I mean,
saved so much money.
Yeah, saved so much money. And for the talent, like they were appreciative too, because they didn't have to like put more work in.
Right.
In a weird way. Like that's not going to be the case for everybody, because obviously people want to be able to monetize their time, and
Definitely.
you know, and that's the question that I think is everybody's grappling with, is like, how do you monetize it, and then even to some degree, how do you regulate it so that it doesn't completely kill off like an entire division or position inside of the film industry. And most recently, I think with Sora, the challenge of that became, what does film infrastructure look like? For creatives, it's an amazing time, because you can, with almost no money, no resource, get something made.
Right.
And I'm more in that camp, but I think I might not be as affected by that as maybe a gaffer would,
Right.
or a PA would, or somebody else that might have a career in a part of the dependency of the infrastructure of film. And so I think I have a skewed opinion on it. I can't speak for it, but I also know that most people that do get into the film industry do want to direct,
Yeah.
or do want to act, or do want to do something else bigger. There are some union people that are doing what they do, and they're very talented at what they do. But I also am a firm believer that a gaffer is just a really skilled electrician, so he or she will find work maybe in another area. But it is scary to think about, like, it could really drastically change what it looks like for a lot of people. But I think with any kind of technological revolution that happens, we used to have people that, I don't know what they're called, but like the telephone operators that would like,
Yeah.
you know,
Switch operators, right?
Yeah. We don't have that anymore.
Yeah.
You know, it's like there's obvious things that are going to be innovated out of certain roles or jobs. And I think for me, it's like there's no better time to be a creator than there is now.
Oh, it's the best time.
It's the best time to be a creator.
Oh my goodness. And you know, the creatives are going to get rewarded, I think, because they have even more tools at their disposal. And it's interesting, you said something at FlowCon that actually was really cool perspective, with things like Sora, right? It's actually kind of an indication of how much we want to be like our Father.
Yeah.
That we want to say things and then it be created. Just like God said, let there be light, and there was light.
Yeah. Interesting.
We can
that was
say-
the ultimate form of like,
Yeah.
and I have this like kind of like maybe even like post-apocalyptic, like scary kind of like visual, but also beautiful is like, you know, we are created beings made by an ultimate creator. And in that he has created all things, including us. And what is the one thing that we want our ultimate form of creation to look like? Us. We want robots to look like us. We want, in the same way that we were created in the image of the Father, we want our now next like version of creation to look like us. And I find it so profound that, like, you know, we want to do all the things that Dad wants to do. We want to speak things into existence. We want, you know, things that we create to like take on forms of more than just, we want it to think for itself to some degree, right? AGI is kind of the idea that like this computer will like think for itself and be able to be more responsive than just being dictated what to do. And maybe even in return, give us love or gratitude, or you know, a feeling of like that we had purpose by building this thing. And I find it very interesting. I'm not trying to take this to a place where like it's maybe like anti-biblical, but like I find a lot of like interest around like that's kind of like where AI, robots, all that is kind of headed. But yeah, I mean, it is very interesting to think about like what the future is going to look like for creating.
Please try opening Spotify to continue.
I was like, where is that coming from?
I don't know if it's me.
Is that God?
God.
Well, that is an interesting tension, right? Of obviously Christian is little Christ, so we want to be like God. But there's a very, you know, fine line with wanting to be God.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And to me, it's like, where does humanity cross that? Because at some point we will, I mean, we are always trying as maybe not as Christians, but as like the human race, this is kind of the next forefront or the frontier that we're, and I think with that, it's like great power comes great responsibility to know how to regulate it, to know how to bring rules around it, but unlimited potential or power unlocking of the mind is what we're talking about here.
And I think something that's really interesting is that people are going to realize who we really are, because now you're building your biases into stuff. And like Google had we talked about it in the last pod, but like you will see yourself. Yeah, you will see yourself
Dude,
come
so
out
crazy.
in the
Like,
stuff you're
how
building.
crazy.
A company like that could have such
Well,
a
that's what I was
blunder.
talking about, right? It's like it is part of that DEI narrative that gets even a company like Google's core mission off mission.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
When I joined Google, it was to organize, it still is today, I think, to organize the world's information to make it universally accessible to all.
Right.
And when they released this AI, it was to confuse the world's information because you got away from first principle,
Yeah.
right? Because there is an agenda.
Yeah.
And so I think that we just have to be aware of that. And why I am a fan of capitalism, I like to think that I have a conscience about it. But what I like about capitalism is that, you know, with something like this, the market will tell you.
Yeah.
Right? The market will tell you. And the market clearly was trying to tell Google, hey, look, like this agenda has gone too far. And now you're confusing me when I'm trying to search information.
Yeah.
I used to go to Google to get facts. Now I'm just getting a perspective.
Out of curiosity, like with something like that, because I'm always trying to figure out when a blunder like that happens, how much of it was there's a specific group of people that had the agenda versus like it's like corporate level or like maybe like leadership level. Obviously, at some point, it has to go up through to leadership, but
I don't think it's too as pervasive as like, oh, this is the whole company.
Yeah.
I definitely don't think that,
Right,
because I know
yeah.
a lot of friends at Google that like were maybe just as shocked as
yeah,
we were.
totally, yeah.
It's definitely a subsection of people. And I definitely think that leadership either was part of it or tolerated it.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's what culture is. We actually talked about that at FlowCon is culture is whatever you celebrate or tolerate. Right.
Yeah.
And so I do think that maybe it was this subtle thing that was invading the company. And it just manifested into this moment where it's like, wow, we have drifted so far. And I think the subtle thing is when companies felt like, oh, DEI is where the market is going. And, oh, okay, there's a business reason. So then we're going to hire certain people. And then maybe those people had some agendas. Maybe some of those people were even radicalized with their agenda and, you know, invaded some of these principles in the company that led them down this pathway. But then again, capitalism, the market will tell you,
Yeah.
you've gone too far.
Ooh, I think the world did tell them. Yeah.
Let's bring some correction to this if you want to continue to compete.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And like one last thing before, I know we're pretty close to time, that I wanted to touch
This
on.
is not one of those 3-hour podcasts on German.
I mean, we could go 3 hours, honestly. But I just want to tie this back to storytelling. And I know right now, Gen AI is like lowering the barrier to entry. Like even in my profession, I think recently Cognition, just built the first like software engineer with AI, and it's like fully, Devin. It's crazy. I might need to look for a new job, but it's like these
Same.
are
Both of us
right.
will need to look for a new job now.
But it's all just tools, right? And I think what this is going to bring out, especially in like this space that you guys are working in as a creative, is like there's more emphasis on storytellers, right? And people that can use these tools to really tell stories. And I feel like we might actually just get more stories, more people that are able to tell their stories and better stories. It's kind of like when the phone camera came out, and now everybody could just take pictures of everything, and like you had Instagram, but now the content that's being created is like leveled up, in my opinion. I don't know. There's a lot more of it, but there's a few creators who are able to like, you know, maximize that. And I feel like, what do you think? Do you think it's going to be better stories out there, or just going to be a lot of people that are just like lowering the bar for what good story?
I mean, I think it's a mix of both. I think you're going to see a lot more crap out there.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, that's just like when you lower the bar, you know, you will just see more things flood into the market. I mean, in our industry, a version of that was like content creators and YouTube, right?
Yeah.
Like YouTube opened up the floodgates for a whole new type of content, storytelling even. And I think from that, you've seen some really beautiful things come out of it that have now made it into theaters and like have like, you know, ultimately prevailed. And I think with that, like I think you just have to learn how to progress. Like I think for me, I don't value my practicality as much as I value my ideas and my maybe the problem solving that I have. So like for me, it doesn't matter what the platform or the tool set is. I'm going to still figure out how to create, and I'm going to use what is available to me to create. And so hopefully that's not bad or crap, but I mean, it could be perceived that way if I'm just using a bunch of AI for stuff. You know, you could probably tell that it's not as good. But I think as this evolves, I think people should learn to adopt what that looks like in that medium. Because I mean, there's no going back from it. It's kind of like you open Pandora's box, and then you're saying like, oh, should you not use this, and to try to be true to. I mean, there's definitely culture, like a cultural aspect of it that I think some people will be very against it. Some people will be for it. I think in the filmmaking industry, it was like when film went from film to digital, there's this whole like group or subset of a group that are very anti-digital, and everything has to be shot on film for it to be original and for it to like feel like the original art form. And I don't know. I've also remembered this story about like when AI was starting to come up, the idea of like how portraits used to be before photography, and it was all like drawings and like really like incredibly talented painters that could almost get it photoreal. And then photography came out and it was like, oh man, we're all out of a job. Nobody's going to draw anymore. Nobody's going to paint anymore. And that wasn't true.
Right.
You know what I mean? Like, so I think that will exist. The previous version of the art form, I think you're just going to see now a lot of the same's true with like, just because the iPhone came out and you can take pictures on your phone, doesn't mean like photography as an industry has suffered or has gotten worse. In some ways it might have gotten better. In some ways that it's just has decentralized certain aspects of it that like anybody can do, you know?
It's good.
That makes sense. Well, we really appreciate you coming out to the podcast.
Let's go.
Do you want to tell the audience what you have coming up next for you in the space?
Yeah, so we've got a couple films that are coming out. I don't have dates for them, so like I don't want to share specific dates. We have one of the cool ones that I'm looking forward to is we have a film about how faith and science actually are more closer together than they are separate or opposite.
Nice. That's huge.
Which has been kind of like a cultural narrative that like you're dumb and you don't really
For sure.
you know use science if you're a faith and vice versa. And there's a lot of cool like scientific discoveries that have happened in the last like 50 years that would show otherwise. And so that's called the working title is The Story of Everything. Cool. And it kind of goes from like early creation to now, and it doesn't really follow right now it's like you either have evolution or you have creationism. It doesn't really follow the creationism narrative either, just because creationism was trying to share science out of the Bible, which is not necessarily what this film or this particular vertical of science is trying to do. It's called intelligent design. We actually have Peter Thiel in the film.
Oh, wow.
Which is actually pretty crazy. So we have people outside of direct faith
circles,
circles and just thought leaders and scientists and
So
stuff
cool.
In the film. So I'm very looking forward to that. I think that's like a great follow-up to After Death. And then we've since created a fintech platform called Saturation, and that's been an effort to build better tools around filmmaking and particularly the film finance management. I tell people all the time, I went to LA to be a creative and I ended up becoming an accountant. And we're trying to help allow creatives to not have to do some of the logistical stuff
I love
we
that,
have to do. Yeah.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Pastor Vance, anything else?
No, man, this was a great conversation. Thanks so much. Pastor Adam, we miss you, but I'm glad that we could open up some space for a guest. And I think we're going to run it back next week.
Yep.
Maybe switch places. Pastor Adam's going to have you and a guest next week. So stay tuned for the next pod because we're going to keep these guests rolling.
Cool. Sounds good.
Yeah.
Cheers,
Thanks for
everybody.
having me.
Yep.
Thanks.
Cheers.